financial savings, which we will call economic value add for those particular households. And we have gone a step further. We've agreed with our partner that we will link the carry that we pay, which you all may be familiar that when you do enterprise investments, there are two kinds of payments. One is the management costs, and the other is a share of profit, which is called carry. And that is actually linked to the development results that the partner is able to generate. So we are very, very, very keen to ensure that we don't lose out one or the other. So I think for us, it's not the investment's not successful if you have a lot of development but no profit, because then you can't sustain the service. And vice versa, of course, if you have profit but not enough development, then the purpose with which UK is financing these enterprises is not achieved. We are looking at investing around 300 million over the next 5 years, so it's quite ambitious, given that we are just starting out. We are looking not only at SMEs, but also at infrastructure, and the partners we are looking at, I've already mentioned SIDBI and National Innovations Fund, but also on affordable housing with the National Housing Bank and with the IDFC and the State Bank of India. We're looking at a mix of credit as well as equity. Any suggestions that you might have on what else we can do are most welcome. There's just one thing more. For agencies like DFID, the reputational issue is quite a big one. So for instance, in the UK, there's a new law on bribery, and it's illegal to give bribes. And we are, we need to adhere to that as much as our investees. So we have developed an ESG framework, as it's called, which is the environment, social and governance standards, which of course IFC and a lot of other agencies are already using, which means that the enterprises that you invest in should be actually having a minimum required standard on labor laws, environment and so on, governance. So we've also linked the carry to that. So we're going to have a baseline assessment of the ESG for our enterprises, and we expect that the enterprise will do better and better as our partner intermediary gives them support to improve on the areas that they are weak on. And again, that's an incentive link. So to answer your questions, I think I've done a lot on results and incentives. But in terms of talent, we feel, with our focus on the 8 poorest states, actually, it's a question for me. Is the best the most expensive, or is the most expensive automatically the best? And I would say that there is, in the venture capital field, there are a lot of people who earn really big salaries, but then they automatically prefer certain kinds of investments and approaches and so on. So maybe that's not necessarily the kind of people that we want to attract to work in our organization, because we need them to actually go to the 8 poorest states. And I think the only compromise they may be making is not money, but also lifestyle and a willingness to look at completely new things, get their feet and hands dirty and so on. So I'm not really sure that we'd be worried about that. I do think that money is not the only driver. So we've had quite a lot of people actually take the initiative to contact us saying, we've been working in this field, we want to do something more relevant, more important, and can we come and work for you? So, and on sources of capital, I think it's been covered, but I think if we can demonstrate the value for money of this approach in achieving the Millennium Development Goals, I think we'll be doing very well and attracting a lot of capital from across a lot of stakeholders. Thank you.
And you're right, Meenakshi, actually we've been very encouraged by the kind of people whom we've been able to attract for the Innovation Fund. These would be people who we know could go out in the market and be making 3 times or 4 times the money, but they think this is fun to do. Royston?
It's just too exciting for me to sit down and talk about it. As a byline, I've talked about the good news really in financial inclusive innovation. So in each of the slides, I'm going to reflect upon really the exciting time that we are in and just the fascinating opportunity that lies ahead of us. As we see, there are tremendous challenges, but huge opportunities. I won't go into each of the numbers, but in every segment we're looking at, if we're looking at 400 million people excluded from mainstream financial inclusion, if we're looking at people below the poverty line in terms of affordable health or education, it's tremendous in terms of the large challenges that lie ahead, but just want to zero in on the huge opportunity that there is and that we are well poised to be able to take hold of those opportunities. When you look at the social enterprises that are really working in this space, looking across the spectrum of enterprises serving the bottom of the pyramid, there are some encouraging trends even there. A lot of the enterprises are fairly young, less than 2 years old, and for me that's a great sign of young people wanting to be able to start something new, people who are committed now to this space, people realizing the opportunity that there is at the bottom of the pyramid, and whether it is as a fallout of fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, or the Nobel Prize to Professor Yunus, or various models that have been tried in that sector, we do see a huge impetus in terms of people trying social enterprises or social businesses, or whatever is the nomenclature that is used. As one of the speakers in the earlier panel talked about, capital seems to be the single largest problem, irrespective of the stage of this social enterprise. So whether it is in the early startup stage, or in the growth stage, or even in the steady state, if you see that number of 82%, where people feel that that is what's consuming their time, that what the social entrepreneur is really focusing on, it gives you a sense, therefore, that capital and the access to capital and the access to finance is going to be critical. And so as the people on this panel as well have spoken, the need to be able to build that ecosystem where this access to capital comes in is something that's going to be critical about. And so I'd like to talk about 3 aspects. One is innovative products, innovative structures, and innovative vehicles. I'd like to give an example here of the Grameen Growth Guarantee product. Microfinance institutions were finding it difficult to access debt from the local banks. And at that time, Grameen, not only in India but in other countries, used the Growth Guarantee product, where it guaranteed banks and said that we will be able to backstop this with a standby letter of credit if you go ahead and leverage this up and give lending to the banks. A simple product. We just heard a similar example from our Italian counterpart on the panel, but again used very effectively. In this case, it was that rich donors didn't even need to put the cash out, but through a line from their bank were able to backstop some of the credit guarantees. So again, a simple tool, but used very interestingly to be able to access funding. Under innovative structures, I'd like to give 2 examples. We know that the banks in India need to meet priority sector regulations and have to have 40% of their assets coming from the priority sector. Many banks struggle to meet this obligation, and within that, the agricultural lending is a big drain in terms of them being able to meet their target. And so we found a lot of money that was coming into these enterprises that worked in that sector, but only in the last quarter of the fiscal year. So we saw in Jan to March a lot of money coming into the system. And we were keen to be able to find a mechanism so we could smooth these cash flows, because the demand was consistent throughout the year for funding, but the supply was coming in only through the last quarter. And so we were able to structure a portfolio assignment transaction whereby whatever ran off during the year could be topped up during the end. So financial structuring can be used to be able to help to bring capital into enterprises that are serving the bottom of the pyramid. Another interesting model we've seen is a clawback structure, where the promoters, which is a social group, wanted to make sure that the mission alignment doesn't get derailed when commercial investors came in. And so they made sure that in their shareholders agreement, a clawback structure was there, that if there was any dilution beyond 25, and they would fall below 25%, then the new incoming shareholders would have to dilute at par so that they could come back in and claw back to be always at 25 or 26%, and therefore make sure that they have a voice in terms of the direction of the company. So financial structuring, again, is something that needs focus when it comes to looking at enterprises that are serving the bottom of the pyramid. In innovative vehicles, I'd like to talk about a term that I've coined, which is an embedded DNA strategy. and I was sharing it with someone over lunch. And really what we've seen, and unfortunately in some cases, is that the social entrepreneur is so keen to build scale that he often dilutes more than he should. A lot of capital comes in, sometimes from angels, sometimes from VCs, and in some sense destroying the social DNA of the enterprise. We've seen that played out in a couple of cases in India and many other countries of the world, where in this race to build scale, and we know scale is important, and we'll talk about it subsequently, but the fact that the social characteristics or the impact focus of the entrepreneur that needs to be ingrained in this organization, and it's like any child, in the first 3 to 5 years of their life is where the bulk of the character of that child is formed. And so in those 3 to 5 years of the formation of this new company, if we are able to allow the social parent, if you want to call that word, to really infuse his DNA into the organization, then it's critical that the dilution does not happen too fast. So are we able to build this capital with a conscience ecosystem where we have the entire stages of capital that need to come in? Do we have, and the Silicon Valley example is absolutely spot on. We are no industry different from any other industry in the world. Just because we serve a population that's at the base of the pyramid doesn't make us any different in terms of needs or in terms of milestones. And so do we have, therefore, the visibility of that ecosystem, and therefore a challenge out to people in this room? Are we able to see a social angel fund? Are we able to see the double bottom line venture capital? Are we able to see the impact private equity? Because each one needs to see their exit at a certain point of time. And how do we build that entire ecosystem, possibly ending with a social stock exchange, where the entire ecosystem is geared to be able to hand off from one to the other, and the ability, therefore, to build scale. Both in terms of debt or equity, the trajectory is pretty similar. The needs, the products that a social enterprise has is pretty similar, but maybe with a few zeros removed from any other sector or any other industry. And yet the amount of focus and mentoring, and I like the comment he said, sit with the professors, keep checking, sit with the experts, and the need to be able to provide that mentoring is absolutely critical to the fund. Being Halloween, I'd like to end with a small case study of a fairy tale which turned into a scary tale. And that really is the way I summarize the situation in the Indian microfinance environment. Indian microfinance was greatly written about, this great story, everything was going great, the great fairy tale story of people growing leaps and bounds. And suddenly, after the Andhra Pradesh crisis and what happened in Indian microfinance, people began to point fingers at it. It became really worrying. And so it's, just from a numbers standpoint, we saw something that was ready to go over $5 billion, and rapidly growing. Money came in from private equity, VCs, hedge funds, IPOs, and a lot of money came into the sector. The ideal trajectory for scale building. So what happened here? And I'd like to summarize my learnings with this picture. Not the ideal learning slide that you would want to see, and some of you would maybe. I can see some smiles. But I want to ask you what this picture says to you, because many of you will have different views. But the take really is that this sector that we are talking about, whether it's microfinance or any other social enterprise, is a sector that's on two legs, the social leg and the commercial leg. And if we are focused only on one leg and ignoring the other, then there is a big problem. You could well focus on only the commercial leg, and Meenakshi talked about, we have all the metrics to be able to track the social, the ROIs and the ROAs and the ROEs, and all the other portfolio metrics that come in with tracking commercial success. But if we have ignored, so you just can't massage and pedicure and look after one leg and completely ignore another, because the human body can't run too far or too fast on one leg. And it could conversely be the true, even if you focused only on social and completely ignored commercial, because again, you can't run too far or too fast on that one leg. And so really, if we are to be able to build financial inclusive innovation, we need to be able to track both social and commercial, Just to answer Vikram's question, one of the tools that Grameen has developed is a Progress Out of Poverty Index, which helps to track clients and see how they've come out of poverty. We ourselves at Grameen Capital help to bridge social enterprises and the mainstream capital markets. We work with a whole spectrum of investors. And again, to Vikram's first question, there are the ideal developmental agencies and social impact funds who would be ideally suited to come into this space. We work across the spectrum of affordable health, housing, technology, financial inclusion, education. We've placed a significant amount of deals that we have advised as investment bankers in the social space. And we do believe that we are able to put our heads together and innovate to create a world without poverty.
Thank you, Royston. We are out of time, but we still have Subrata with a request to be a bit brief. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is always the challenge if you're the last speaker, but nevertheless, I'll try to be as quick as possible. And I think, I'll not go through a lot of the points which my esteemed colleagues have already, pointed out. Before you go into the, the main topic of the day, one of the things that we are grappling within IFC, which is, part of the, private sector arm of the World Bank Group, is there is a lot of talk about, inclusive projects, and then there's a lot of talk about innovative projects. Perhaps one question that we should also ask ourselves is, what is a project that is not inclusive? So, when we're talking about projects, how do we define projects which are inclusive? I'm going to talk about how we look at it purely from a private sector perspective. So, basically, what happens is, when we interact with the private sector, there is a lot of discussion around how we are creating good for the society, and a lot of those discussions go around CSR activities. In our view, if a client is saying that my project is an inclusive project, the way we would like to define it is central to their business model should be an element that combines private and public benefit. In other words, if that business model stops, the company's operations also stop. That is not the case with CSR. That, in our view, is a very well-defined methodology of differentiating a CSR project from an inclusive project. And I'll give you some examples of how we are actually doing that in practice, seeing that in practice. The second one is one of innovation. And I think, again, the ring fencing that I would like to do here is innovation that are going to address the key development challenges. So imagine the pyramid of 7 billion population, and in the morning people talked about the rich, and we did a publication where we tried to size the market of 4 billion population, right? That 4 billion population is very different from the top 3 billion population, who I think all of us sitting in this room are essentially belong to the top pyramid. So if you look at the way traditionally private sector has served the top 3 billion population and the business models that they've used, those models have actually failed to serve the bottom of the pyramid population. So here there is a need for innovation to actually serve the people at the base of the pyramid. Now when you bring in the, the angle of the private sector, obviously the private sector cannot help the entire people who are the abject poverty. You have to segment that 4 billion population and see how you can address some of the needs of this population. So very quickly, with that framework, I'm just going to take you very quickly through how we look at it. We are all aware the market opportunity sizing. I mean, this is basically a fairly new industry. 2004, not even 10 years back, people started talking about the base of the pyramid. There was an IFC publication along with WRI where we sized the market, and the total size of the market was around $5 trillion. Now, this is a huge market size, but if you talk to people, the practitioners, you will realize that meeting this market is a big challenge. So therefore, if you look at the traditional sectors, the 6 sectors which my colleague just showed, which came out in the IntelliCap study, is pretty much health, energy, education. There is a lot of challenge of meeting those markets. One of the things that we're trying to do in IFC is to really ring fence our operations and try to define what does inclusive projects mean by, what do we mean by inclusive projects. So we did actually a scanning of the entire portfolio. Typically, we invest anything between 15 to $20 billion every year. And out of the total projects that we did in a portfolio over the last 6 years, we found that around 200 companies are there in a portfolio which meets this definition of inclusive projects that I just talked about, which is actually a very small percentage of the total portfolio that you have. The total investment that we have made in this is just $6 billion. There are emerging market companies which are looking at BOP as a growth segment. But again, in our experience, when we've invested in these companies, when we have worked with them, we have realized that there are significant challenges that they've faced when they actually try to enter that market. So it's not an easy game out there. There are a lot of donors, including us, who are saying that we need to evolve market-based solutions. And when one talks about market-based solutions, I think the fundamental principle which at least IFC talks about is it should be commercially viable. And once a project is commercially viable, then we start looking at how do you look at the social returns, how do you, kind of quantify the impact that you have. And we have developed various indicators to basically monitor the performance of those. The other very interesting area that we're seeing is the foundations and the social investors who are looking at this space. Earlier, they were in a regime of purely grant and philanthropy, and now they're moving into a regime where what I call the blended capital. So basically, you are mixing commercial and grant money to support such innovations, which then can address some of the development challenges. And the final 2 point is, in our minds, it is very important to define this field, the inclusive business field, and how do you best use the resources to support the scale and to support the scale of this project, because some of my colleagues earlier mentioned that it is not possible for every project to scale, which we perfectly are aware of. But especially for countries like India, if you look at the scale of the problem that we have, unless we find a solution which is scalable, it will not have the desired impact. So I talked to you about the analysis of the portfolio of the 200 companies, and these are the 7 models that we found, where I will not go through the details to save time, but I think central to all of these models, we have seen the private sector client engaging very profitably with the supply chain and developing a sustainable business model. In other words, when they actually developed the model, it was required some donors would come and put some soft money to help prove that model. But the fundamental principle was, once you have proven the model right, it was sustainable and one could exit, the donors could exit, but the client and the beneficiaries are working on those projects, and it is a sustainable proposition. So I'll just take maybe the one example, number 7, e-transaction platforms, which is a case here in India, where a lot of you might have heard about Fino, which was basically an e-transaction platform. When it started, we were not sure how the model would go. It was a very innovative project of e-payments and different kinds of financial services that could be given to people at their doorstep in the rural areas. So the story was, initially it struggled for the first 2 years to reach 1 million population, consumers, and now they have 40 million consumers over a period of around 5 to 6 years. So there was a massive scale up of the model because it was sustainable, and we had exited the project from a support point of view, but it's a sustainable model. So I'll leave the slides with the organizer so you can have a look at it.
Okay.
I'll not go through these examples.
Yeah, I think
in conclusion, the last one was, I talked about the financing for the inclusive innovations. So if you look at the whole spectrum, there is a grant, there are blended capital and commercial capital. The challenge for us is, how do you essentially look at each of these sources of money and use it for the right purpose. Different models at different stages of maturity requires different kinds of capital. Social enterprises might require grants first, but when they are in a growth part, they would need blended capital followed by commercial capital. I think metrics and standards, a lot of my colleagues have already talked about. Only the last point which people have not talked about is, I think we also need to realize that because people are really struggling it out, we need to figure out how do you provide enough recognition for these people, for people who are following the inclusive and innovative models. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run well over time, so we will skip the questions and answers, and all of us will be around. So perhaps during tea, coffee, lunch, we can do all of that. I would just want to thank the panelists very much for their contributions, and just make the one comment that the really good thing seems to be that the consensus that emerges from what everybody says. There's a lot in common with what everyone is saying. And secondly, a lot of learning that we've had as we create this inclusive innovation fund seems to have huge similarities with what each of you have said. A lot of that has gotten embedded in what we're doing. So thank you very much. The next session that we have now is going to be chaired by Nandan Nilikani, who's a good friend and one of the most successful entrepreneurs in India, although these days he's known less for the company he helped create, Infosys, as for this really innovative project that he's running in India, which is the Unique ID Authority. Nandan, all yours.
Hi, Gopi, come. Yeah, good afternoon and welcome to the next session. This session is titled Learning from Global Good Practices, not global best practices. So it's global good practices because the best is the enemy of the good and all that stuff, I guess. So learning from global good practices, and my name is Nandan Nilikani and I chair the Unique ID Authority of India, and I'll be chairing this session. I think we have a very, very interesting, distinguished, and very diverse panel. So I think we really have a good opportunity to learn global good practices from all of them. I'll briefly introduce them. We have Mr. Petri Peltonen here. He is the Director General of the Ministry of Employment and Economy in Finland. Then after that, we'll have Mikael Hjellstrom here. He's the Deputy Manager from the Swedish Energy Agency. Then we have Ms. Kristen Bound. She's the Lead Policy Advisor, Innovation, Investment and Growth at Nesta in the UK. Then we have Dr. Gopi Katragada. He's the Head and Managing Director of G India Technology Center, I assume, in Bangalore. And then we have finally Mr. Dirk Pilat, who's the OECD, he's from the OECD. So I think we really have a fantastic panel, very diverse, great experience, great insights. So I think we'll sort of get into it. I would request all the speakers to manage the time. Everybody has 7 minutes, and I would earnestly request you to stay within your 7 minutes. And so we'll have essentially each of them giving their point of view on this topic of learning from global good practices, and then after that, we'll have discussions and questions, and then I'll summarize at the end. So without further ado, I'd request Mr. Peltonen to start with his 7-minute.
Thank you very much, Nandan. Dear colleagues and friends of innovation. Sharing the Finnish best practices, I think, is certainly a challenge, and in a way, clearly we are all in a learning fashion. As I already mentioned in the morning, I think one of the key, at least elements of the Finnish innovation policy and its implementation is really an open partnership. So in that sense, I think it's been stemming throughout the Finnish policy making since the onset of the technology and science policies in the early 1980s. And by partnership, I really mean by, first of all, that the policies are developed in an open dialogue, not only by the politicians, but really with the scientific and the industrial community. So in that sense, building national policies is very much sort of an open process, as it is in most of the Scandinavian countries. In that sense, in a way, the sort of a commitment also to the policy implementation probably is stronger and in other cases. And of course, partnership is then also visible in the implementation of the policies. Actually, I can leave the slide so they don't have to be shown. So in the implementation of the policies, and very much the two key sort of science and innovation agencies in Finland, the Academy of Finland for Public Research and Tekes for industrial technology and innovation support, are really also implementing the partnership procedures, first of all through funding incentives. So in simple terms, the public funding is incentivizing for collaboration and partnership, be that the public research or industrial or support for industrial pre-competitive development. So in that sense, money is a good consultant, and for example, the university research in Finland, especially the one which is supported by our ministry, is co-funded, co-supported by private enterprises. So in that sense, it keeps the relevance issue also in mind when it comes down to research. And of course, Finland being a small country, being able to partner with the international partners within the European Union and more broadly on a global scale is a must. So in that sense, we do believe that in many ways the national policy making and especially its implementation has lost its relevance. It's not really Finland working with other countries. It's really our top institutions, top people finding their partners, be they those in India or in any other part of the world. So in that sense, really the openness of the science and innovation ecosystem, I think, is truly evident, and it's also challenging the policy making. So developing national policies, especially for a small country, are somewhat difficult, and they at least have to be immediately seen in an international or not to mention global dimension. And lastly, to sort of share some of the latest thoughts is obviously that it's not only investing public money, but it's creating other incentives for innovation. And there clearly the competition and market orientation is clearly a driver. Clearly any company is not innovating for the pleasure of innovation, but from the pressure of competition and for the opportunities, the new opportunities to grow. So in that sense, us as policymakers to be able to open up markets for fair sort of a competition which is really stimulating new solutions, I think, is an area. There, for example, public procurement, I think, is an instrument in all countries where really public procurement could be used as an incentive and driver when seeking new solutions in healthcare, in energy, in clean technology. So in that sense, being able to make sure that the public sector is really a sort of a lead procurer in terms of innovation is an opportunity which is not really exploited efficiently, at least in Finland, and I would say not necessarily on a global scale either. And the third dimension, obviously, in innovation promotion is really engaging the users. We had an excellent session just preceding us where really the user orientation, the crowd sourcing sort of dimensions are strong new drivers for innovation, performance and implementation. It's challenging us as policymakers, and in many ways, especially in this user and sort of application-oriented innovation policies, I think India is a great example where we all have a lot to learn. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Petri. That was great. And now I'll request Mikael Dahlström to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm from the Swedish Energy Agency, and I will tell you about our role to accelerate development of low-carbon technologies, and more specifically about the Swedish innovation platform, Indo-Swedish innovation platform that is being tested this very moment. Actually, the more hands-on testing were taking place in Hyderabad this week, starting up Monday and finish up yesterday, 11:30 in the night. So we work together with a confederation of Indian industry, and they have been pivotal for us to making this innovation platform between our countries possible. And now I'm going to give you the context of our work by present some slides, one slide about the Swedish Energy Agency. We work with the entire growth chain from very basic research to market implementation. And therefore, it's very important for us to work together with the industry and the users of the technology. And some tools that we use are carbon-related policies, some policy work, and also we work with clean development mechanisms, such as the CO2 emission trading. We also have grants and grants for more basic research and loans for business development, as I work mainly with. We also initiate some specific projects, such as the Swedish innovation platform, which I shall tell you a little bit more about now. Can you change slide, please? The reason to establish a platform for exchange for low carbon technologies between India and Sweden is very straightforward. The energy challenge is global, and the country as Sweden and India actually shares a lot of shares the challenge together intimately. The challenge is the same for our countries, but we have seen that the solutions are quite different. Can you change slide? This slide shows very clearly why there is the difference. The solution for the marketplace today needs to be perfectly adapted to the market that they addresses. For example, the customer demand is different, which affects the business model. Price, business model, functionality, and packaging needs to be fit to the local market. And for this to happen, we believe that there is a need for close interaction in the development of product and business models to overcome those barriers. The good news is that we think that the joint development between Sweden and India will be interesting to other parts of the world as well. We have selected several Swedish companies, and we are focused on three different areas of problems. Encourage the use of electricity in transportation, making the energy-intensive industry more energy efficient, and using the sun as a energy source more widely. In the first version of this initiative, we chosen 6 companies to participate. They all have a willingness to enter the Indian market, and they also have a willingness to come together with us in this experimental building up of this initiative. The most important thing is that we believe that these companies have a strong market case if they are succeed. Yesterday we have a lot of matchmaking together with the Confederation of Industry, and we have a lot of brainstorming and that sort of thing. Yeah, can change slide, please. I'll tell you a little bit about the companies that is participating in this challenge. And first company is NLab Solar, who is working with the third generation solar cells. There is solar cells who's transparent and are printable. Absolicon is working with combined heat and solar units. And Climate Check develop a software that allows performance analysis on refrigerators, air conditioners, and heat pumps during system operation. Opcon Energy System is a company which produce small-scale production from waste heat of electricity. Clean Motion is a company who have a small auto rickshaw who's driving on electricity. ChargeStorm has developed an intelligent charging infrastructure system that creates the grid, makes the grid stabilized, and they also have some ideas about making smart home to stabilize the grid. The next step in this is we have set a base on partnership in India, and now with the feed testing and the model for innovation, and develop the cooperation with CII. Now we are going to follow up, hopefully with fundings and project proposals. We will also monitoring the process and fine-tune and upgrade the initiative. We also have some joint workshop together with CII to do. And we want to emphasize that this is a learning process, and we hope that we're going to make this platform to a continuous link between India and Sweden. And you can follow the work on indoswedish.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikael. And now I'd like to request Ms. Kristen Baum from Nesta to make up. Oh, sure.
Thanks for this opportunity. My name's Kirsten Bound. I work for an innovation foundation in the UK called Nesta. My idea today was to very quickly tell you a little bit about our unusual organisation and the way we work to try and catalyse innovation, but also to tell you a little about how we've tried to learn from good practice in India, and to finish with a recipe for learning from global good practice. So Nesta is an unusual innovation foundation. We don't just finance innovation, we try and work across the system. So also developing knowledge about innovation, developing capabilities and skills, and also joining those networks together to get the greatest impact for our cash. In practice, for example, looking at our support for the startup community, we are both a venture capital investor and an impact investor. We develop a large amount of analysis and knowledge on equity financing in the UK, looking at the equity gap, but also looking at those new ideas for financing, which are bridging gaps in the UK, for example, in SME credit. For example, looking at crowdfunding, equity crowdfunding, and looking at peer-to-peer lending models. We're trying to both have a deep base of knowledge on innovation economics, but also to look forward at the innovation trends and try and be the first to gather the useful data which can be applied. We combine all this practical knowledge and analysis into capacity building toolkits, which we try and make as widely available as possible and free as point of use. And we also, as well as directly investing in companies, we invest in the ecosystem. For example, here in a range of different kinds of incubators and accelerators. Not only does that help us to develop our own pipeline, but also we can directly compare the impact of different approaches. So I wanted to talk very briefly about some recent research we've done looking at the Indian innovation system over the last 5 years, directly trying to learn from global good practice here. Some work we did in collaboration with the British High Commission, with research funding agencies, and with the British Council UK ERI. I'm going to apologise in advance, I'm going to whiz through these, but I will make available the reports to anyone who's interested and wants to look into more detail. So we looked at all the available data. We looked at the comparative picture. India perhaps doesn't look like the science superpower that we thought it might be at the height of the BRICS hyperbole 10 years ago. But we also broke down those aggregated averages and tried to map what this looks like across the country. So these little dots, if you can actually see there, we're mapping world-class research across India. And there you can see the development of particular hubs, but also the emergence of new places. And actually we found that some of the highest concentration of world-class research was actually in Trivandrum, right down at the south. We also looked at shifting patterns of research collaboration. So highlighted, if you can see there, is the UK. I mean, the UK's funding over that 5-year period for joint research with India has grown from about 8 to about 80 million pounds. But as you can see, it's part of a rising tide as everyone seeks to increase collaboration with India. I think the interesting thing there is going to be regional collaboration if you look at the increase in the South Korea research. And we're very excited to see what comes out of those collaborations. we drilled down to understand the kind of geography of the world-class research partnerships with the UK as well. While that helps with some of our strategic planning and thinking about where we put our resources in terms of collaborating with India, what I'd say is just as important is that we're very interested also in what the data can't tell us. And one of the things Nesta is well known for in the UK is trying to move beyond these traditional indicators of innovation performance like R&D spending and bibliometrics, and to try and understand a deeper picture about the intangible investments and shifts which are going on in innovation systems. I remember being really struck in 2006 when I was sitting in the audience at the Indian Science Congress in Hyderabad by what Amartya Sen claimed was the biggest challenge facing us. The future can't be half California and half sub-Saharan Africa. Coming back to look at the Indian innovation system after 5 or 6 years, I mean, what's striking to me is just how far that kind of mission is being followed. It's inspirational to see the shifts which have happened in terms of encouraging the best minds to work on the problems of the poor. I'm not going to talk about any of these examples in detail. They're covered throughout the event, but we're fascinated in seeing the different business models and approaches, the combinations of high tech with new business models which reach communities at scale. You know, whether that's extreme examples of collaboration, leveraging resources in new ways, thinking about product service ecosystems rather than just products, or leveraging new technology platforms. We believe there's a fascinating opportunity for experimentation here, and the UK can't afford not to be part of it. We've heard about how relevant this is to the West in terms of not only our long-term problems, you know, the fact that half of those children born today in the UK are going to live to over 100. Our public services simply can't cope with the future in their current formats. We need the kind of radical inspiration that comes from the problem-solving underway in India to influence our own work. And combination with new technology platforms, with programs like the Universal Identity Program, give us fascinating opportunities for experimentation. So for my last slide, I want to offer a kind of recipe for how to learn from what works. Now, I don't know, out of the thousands of policy reports that all of us have read, have you ever found one which ends in something where there is not a complex answer, and when there is a one-size-fits-all solution? It would be very nice if they ended up like that, but unfortunately it's always the opposite. I think there's a recipe of ingredients which we need from learning from best practice, combining evidence, experimentation, examples and toolkits, and peer support, and those are the things we'd like to collaborate on. It's a dirty secret that the level of evidence in innovation policy is very, very low, and we'd like to work to increase that. Our Alliance for Useful Evidence in the UK is a coalition of well over 400 organisations that tries to not only help organisations to capture evidence on what works, but also to understand how to use evidence in our own work to encourage changes throughout the system. In terms of experimentation, in the West, I think our innovation policy is still driven by a very narrow understanding of a response to market failure. And we need to encourage a type of innovation policy which is far more experimental, which draws far more on the principles of innovation that we understand, that is comfortable with a higher level of uncertainty. And drawing on the examples from India or the democratization of innovation that we heard of earlier is a great influence on us in our work at the moment. Also, toolkits and examples. There are many out there. We find they're very difficult to access. Sometimes they're driven and captured by particular products. We're developing a new platform where we're trying to make available as many as possible of these methods and approaches of stimulating, of prototyping, of scaling innovation as possible. And lastly, peer support. I mean, I suppose that's what this event in some ways is about. I was encouraged by looking around the room at the people that Nesta is already collaborating on, whether it's with UNDP on innovation inducement prizes, with the OECD on understanding how firms grow, whether it's with Google on understanding the impact of data analytics on innovation. But we'd like to increase those collaborative relationships even further and create a strong channel of information about new practice as well as best practice, not just at the policy level, but at the level of the intermediaries, those actors that really need to apply this knowledge. So thanks very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kristen. And now I'll ask Dr. Gopi Katragada from GE. Gopi?
Thank you, Nandan, and thanks, Kristen, for putting up ECG machine from GE. I don't know if you knew it was from GE. It makes telling my story also a little easier. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll share my perspectives from 3 different angles. One is, I'll actually not be using the slides, so you can. So one is from telling the story of GE, which is a story of electrification, and how we've created innovation for over 130 years, and what a nation can also learn from that. The other is the story of GE in India, and the technology story of GE in India actually has both Sam and Mashelkar as key contributors for our starting point, so I would like to share that story. And also as an innovator and part of the small business industry in the US, some of the lessons I learned while there is something which I would like to share. So starting off with the GE story, many times it's confusing for many people to understand how come a company can be in so many different businesses. Is there at all any strategy, or is it just happenstance and random events which got us here? And I'll make the case that it is a very innovative and innovation-based approach to building this company. And most of you know that the founder of the company was Edison. Most of you might not know that he did not invent the light bulb. He made improvements to the light bulb and patented it, but he did develop the centralized electric generation and transmission system in the US, which made it possible to use light bulbs at homes and replace gas lighting. So the story of GE is really that of electrification. Anything which can be electrified, now that you're getting electricity to homes and labs, you go about electrifying. And that's the story of the innovation. So the generation started with steam dynamos, then went to steam turbines, and then gas turbines. So that's our energy business. Once you have gas turbines, a jet engine is nothing but a gas turbine, so that's our aviation business. By the way, the light bulb and the research which goes into that is the same research which produces an X-ray tube, which is nothing but a vacuum tube similar to a light bulb. And so that started our healthcare business, which then grew from X-ray to CT to MR and now to life sciences. Electrification into homes also meant that we convert gas stoves into electric stoves, so that made our appliances business. When US was going through the Great Depression, we financed our own appliances. That started our capital business. We started with electric locomotives, went to diesel locomotives. Today we are doing hybrid locomotives, so that's our transportation business. You might wonder, what about NBC Universal, which we had a stake in? The high-frequency alternator, which produces electricity, is an outcome of knowing how to produce or a high-frequency alternator transmit signals. So you need that to transmit signals. It came out of our energy business. So voice and video gets transmitted using an high-frequency alternator. That's how our NBC business started in collaboration with RCA. So if you think about what does that mean to India and what can we learn from that, you can create a century of wealth with an idea. So electrification was the idea. So we need to identify what is it for a country like India, what is the next age, and build on it. So we need to focus and invest our resources into a couple of areas and really create the wealth in that manner. Few other lessons, smashing the hand-mind market barrier is something which I'll mention. In India, over the years, in the past, we had communities which were working with hands, communities which were working with minds, communities who understood markets. This will not propel innovation. So those barriers have been removed, and that is why we are able to create magic now. We need to create a destination for the best global talent. That's how Edison was able to use a person like Steinmetz, who was an immigrant from Europe, to create the magic of electricity. Policy framework around environment, health, energy, and intellectual property needs to be right. There's no question about it. So with that, I'll just move on to the GE India story very briefly. We started very early in India. 1902, the first hydro turbine which was set up in India, in Asia, was a GE hydro turbine in Shivasamudram, the state I am from in Karnataka. The first nuclear plants in India were set up by GE in Mumbai, Tarapur 1 and 2. The first BPO operations in India were set up by GE as well. However, until the markets opened up in 91, we did not come to India strategically. We came at that point to enter the appliances market, but we came too early with very high-end appliances, not the right cost points, so we've learned from that. At that point, instead of exiting, we invested in the local talent, teamed up with TCS, Satyam, created the engineering power that today is part of my organization. And also we collaborated with the National Chemical Laboratories, which formed the genesis of the global research team, which is in Bangalore as well. So from that exercise, what we have learned, and by the way, today we produce 400 patents on an annual basis, which is a very significant portion of what GE does globally. Each patent is worth quite a bit if you look at it going into products. In India also, we, based on the work which we do for India, from about 10% of the team members that we have, we produce today $200 million in revenue, and in 2 years we'll be producing $400 million in revenue. That's just from 10% of the workforce. So the impact was there. So definitely we can be innovative in this country and make a big impact. Great talent. I think if we can get faster on policy making and execution, there's no stopping us. Finally, just winding up in the interest of time on India, we are in a position to be a lead market today. In energy, we have an ability to, we need 200 gigawatts right now. It's not in the next 10 years. We need additional 200 gigawatts right now, which in generation means $200 billion, which in transmission and distribution is another $200 billion. That's $400 billion in market. And we can use that to drive innovation that we want rather than take adapted innovation from elsewhere. In healthcare, we are at 5% of GDP. We should grow to 10% of GDP. Developed economies are at 15% of GDP. So that's doubling in healthcare expenditure. So we can demand what we want in healthcare. We'll be adding 1,000 plus locomotives in the next 10 years. And water by 2020, if you use all the known sources of water, we cannot meet the demand. So we have an ability to be the lead market, and we should be the lead market. A few thoughts on how we get there overall. We need to excel in graduate programs, connect them to the market. Today, if I go to a graduate school, many times I get turned back, even being GE, because their coffers are full with funding from the government, which have, as they told me, no strings attached. So they prefer that kind of funding. So we need to make sure that the strings matter. It is what makes innovation real. Small business innovative research is a great model from United States, which we can look at. There is some amount of that happening. The funding which comes into enabling small businesses to kickstart, but we need a lot more. And larger industry partnerships, similar to the ones which DOE, NIH, and DOD are making happen, is again another area which we can do a lot more. And basically, ease of setting up and running a business, if it is much easier, I would not be working for GE, I would be running my own company. So with that, I hand it back to you, Narendra.
Thanks, Gopi. Thank you very much. Now we have our final speaker for this panel, Mr. Dirk Pilat from the OECD.
Thank you very much, Chair, and it's a pleasure to be here. I had initially thought to talk a little bit about public procurement, but I will not do that because I thought this morning there were a couple of interesting questions raised, and I'd like to talk a little bit about experimentation. Just a few words about the OECD. I mean, we do a lot of work around innovation policies as well. We do a lot of work around measurement. And I think one of the things which I'm realizing here in India and also increasingly that there are quite a few aspects to innovation which we still have great difficulty measuring. There are a lot of dimensions which are very hard to get to, and I think we still need to do a lot better around that. We talked this morning a little bit about scaling and the need for scaling of innovation projects. And I think one of the things you need for scaling is high growth firms. You need to have firms which really of business models which really scale up, grow over time. And I think we therefore need to look a little bit, well, what is the experience with these high growth firms? Where do they come from? Where do they emerge? And what are some of the policies which influence these firms? We're doing a little bit of work at the moment together with Nesta, where we were comparing the US experiences with European experiences, and not saying that all of this is necessarily directly of relevance to India, but I think there are a couple of lessons which we can learn from that. What we find in the US is basically what happens is that firms enter, and they either are up, they go up, and in terms of they grow very quickly, or they're out. So basically it's a very quick selection process where things happen. In Europe, what happens is that firms grow or come into the market, but typically they stagnate at a certain scale very quickly already. And what we then looked at is basically to try and understand where does this come from? What are some of the factors which drive this? And I think a lot of this has to do with the climate for experimentation. Can you try? Can you really have a go and try to create a company, scale a business model over time? A couple of things which really come in there is bankruptcy legislation. I mean, can you fail? What are the conditions under which you can fail? Can you try again? Are there serial entrepreneurs in your economy? What is the condition in the labor market? I mean, one difficulty I think we see happening a lot in Europe, if you are creating a company, can you quickly hire people? But also, if your business model doesn't succeed, can you actually lay them off over time again? And again, this creates difficulties for firms which are very experimental, which are very innovative. Also, of course, we talked a lot already about financing, which I think is a crucial dimension on this. And typically the debate, at least, and unfortunately sometimes in Europe, is very much we need more venture capital. It's not just the money, it's really about the experience. It's about everything related to that. And I think there are some interesting examples which we're starting to see emerge increasingly also in Finland, for instance, accelerated programs where there's a link really to try and connect the financing to people, experienced entrepreneurs who can really scale up a company. I think one aspect, and we didn't talk about that a lot, I mean, what we know from entrepreneurship as well, a lot of the people who create companies are people who actually have a background in this area, who also, family has a background into creating a company. But how do you broaden the pool? How do you broaden the pool of people who are willing to try and create a company and really put it into your mind that this is actually a thing you can do? I think, therefore, we need to go back to education, and we need to go back to very early education. If there's one thing we've learned from the work at the OECD on education policy, that if you really want to change mindsets, you need to change at a very early age. We're not talking here about bringing a little bit of entrepreneurship education into universities. You need to start doing this already at primary school, or sometimes even before, if you really want to expose people to the idea of that creating a company is perhaps a good idea. Let me go briefly into what I was intending to talk about when I arrived this morning, which was demand-side policies, because I think what we heard a lot also in the discussions this morning is the whole focus on challenges, on focus on, which I think in India is a really interesting example of where you're trying to put the focus not so much on what we typically have been doing on the supply side in terms of trying to create R&D, create technology, but to look at it really for what are the problems we need to solve. And I think that is a different dimension, and where we still need to develop some of the good practices, where we still need to develop what really is working. Public procurement, Petri Peltonen mentioned it a second ago, I think is a very interesting example here, where governments are spending huge amounts of money. If you can start